guest is Mr. Frank DOBSON. We're going to talk about his life, his career. We're going to have some very, very interesting conversations, and we might finally tell some jokes. So, ladies and gentlemen, we want to welcome you to the show. And first of all, thank you, my brother, for coming and being a part of this.
Thank you, sir.
It means a lot to me to have you here.
Okay.
All right, so let's get into it. First of all, who is Frank DOBSON?
Frank DOBSON is the child of Frank Sr. and Willa DOBSON. I was born in Buffalo, New York.
Okay.
Inner city background, working class parents. My dad worked at a steel mill for 40 years.
Okay.
My mom, among other things, worked in the home of a very, very wealthy white family in Buffalo. How wealthy? They were so wealthy that they actually owned an amusement park, an entire amusement park in Ontario, Canada. You know, Buffalo's right close to Canada. So I grew up with parents who, although we were not wealthy, they instilled in us the values that I think are so important for all of us. Hard work, faith in God, you know, the importance of family. And so, and I'll talk a lot about my mom, particularly because she really poured into us. We would be, like myself and my sisters, the three little kids who, because we didn't own a car when I was a kid, we'd be walking to or riding the bus to the downtown library to get library books. Because my mom wanted to make sure that we were readers, that we were children who knew the value of an education. I think that's so important for us as African American people. So even though my mom never finished high school, never finished high school, she instilled in us a love of learning. And here her son is, all three of her children went on to post-secondary education. One sister ended up becoming a dental technician and getting an associate's in that. One sister got a bachelor's degree. I ended up with 3 degrees, a bachelor's, master's, PhD. So my mom really invested in us this whole notion of, you're going to be something, and you're going to be something, I won't say better, because I don't think I'm better than her, but you're going to do something better, you know? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That makes perfect sense to have that kind of a foundation. So,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
was there something specific that sort of locked you into the ideas that were being imparted into you? Like sometimes people will teach us things, but we might not grab a hold to it. So was there something about you that when you were taught these things by your mom and your parents and whomever else, was there something about you that made you grab onto this stuff and sort of push that ball forward?
Well, you know, we're in this incredible building of the church, and this brings back memories, because when I was a little black kid growing up in Buffalo on Myrtle Street, there was a woman down the street who had what she called the Good News Club.
Okay.
And we would go to the Good News Club, and I wasn't supposed to be in it because I was too young. I was like 5 years old. But in the Good News Club, we did reading, we did coloring, we did those things. And that Good News Club told me I was special. And you know, as a little black kid, if you believe that, the sky's the limit. And then throughout that time, whether it was in young people, willing workers, and in church later on, after I accepted the Lord, it was always somebody who was saying to me, you can do this, whatever that this is. So my mom was a reader, even though she did not go to college. She read French novels in translation, right? I say that because my sister Daphne is named after a French novelist, Daphne du Maurier, because my mom was reading those novels. They're like, well, this woman didn't go to college, so what? Mm-hmm. You know, and I was talking with a student at Vanderbilt. I was telling you before we started that we were doing a retreat with a bunch of students. We had about 70 students up there, and one young man was saying, you know, well, you got to do this and you got to do that, and you have to. Your job defines you, or your background defines you. I'm like, no. And my mom taught me that nobody defines me but myself and God. You know?
Yes, sir.
And so to me, to have a mother who was this kind of incredible reader, I never thought about the fact that my mom was uneducated, because she wasn't. You know, she didn't have the degrees and diplomas, but she was as educated as any of the people I meet at Vanderbilt in some ways. Yeah. So that was the blessing, brother. That was the blessing.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you've mentioned reading a few times.
Yes, I have.
How valuable is reading to our experience moving forward?
You know, I always tell people, I used to teach a lot in colleges and universities. I've taught as an adjunct at Fisk. I'm over at Vanderbilt and taught there, other places. And I always talk about the story of Frederick Douglass, who of course was this great slave who ended up becoming a free man because he escaped to freedom. But the fact of the matter is that Douglass talks about this in his autobiography, that he knew it was a crime for a slave to be taught to read and write. But he was able to, if you read the autobiography, he was able to convince this little white boy, because he was like indentured out to these people, and he was working for him, and his little white kid was working for him, and he convinced this kid by giving him food, teach me to read, because he knew that that was part of the key to his emancipation. He wasn't free at that time, but he was already putting in place the bricks as you're building the building, the bricks of his building to get out of slavery. And so for me, I always think about the fact that education, and Malcolm X said this, education is our passport to liberation and freedom. And so to me, that's so true. We have to know. We have to know. We have to know everything we can know, right?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I want to ride that wave a little bit.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Education. So, how are we doing right now in education in terms of teaching our young people and actually teaching ourselves? How are we?
You know, my brother, I don't know if we're doing as well as we could do.
Okay.
Because of the fact that there's so much income disparity.
Okay.
And for example, I've been at Vanderbilt since 2004, right? And I used to go to a church on South 12th, and the pastor of the church one day called me up. I was a director of the Black Cultural Center there. Now I'm one of the deans over at Vanderbilt. And he said, Brother Dobson, I need some students to come over here and tutor some of the kids from the Edgehill Housing Project. Well, I was director of the Black Cultural Center, so I had a lot of black students that I was working with, but I was also living on campus, which I still do, my wife and I do, in what Vanderbilt has like living, learning, where faculty and deans and stuff live with the students. And in that house, it was much more diverse than the students at the Black Cultural Center, mainly black kids. It was white kids, Asian kids, black kids, etc. And I said, those are the kids I'm going to tap, because I want them to see something. So we started tutoring and mentoring at Progressive Baptist on South 12th. At the time, Reverend Henry Blaze was the pastor, and I knew Reverend Blaze well. Matter of fact, for a while I went there. And we started doing it, and transformation started happening. But the transformation said to those kids who were white and Asian from all over the country and the world who were tutoring, these kids didn't get what we got, because we came from more wealthy backgrounds, more privileged backgrounds. We're tutoring a kid who's in the 5th grade but is reading at a 2nd grade level. Or trying to do math problems with a kid who's in the 6th grade but is at a 3rd grade level in terms of math competency. And that said to them, what I already knew was that so much of the problems are that it seems as though we're leaving certain people behind in our society now. People like you and me, we're doing okay. Not to speak for you, but you know what I mean?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
But there's some people in our communities who have seemingly been left behind. There's some schools that are overperforming, and I think so much of that has to do with the fact that economically they've been left behind, and so we're forgetting about them. So my whole thing, as a Christian, as a writer, as an educator, is how can we make sure that we don't leave any children behind? So I don't think we're doing as well as we could, to answer your question.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, so the instigator in me just can't resist.
That's okay, brother. That's okay.
If you were, say, director of schools, or if you were somehow in charge of the construct of education here in Nashville, what's your top 3 things that you would change? Or what's the top 3 things that you would actually do?
My wife and I, I'm going to answer this by personalizing. My wife and I, at one point, had our children in Dayton Public Schools. I was at Wright State University in Dayton, and I was teaching there. Okay. And one of our kids was in a sort of like a magnet type school, right? There was a teacher there that looked like you or me, who didn't want to be at that school, didn't want to be in an inner city school, wanted to be in a suburban school. And we saw that manifested in the way this person treated our children. Okay. And it was interesting because when we came for the teacher conference, I think the person thought they would talk down to us until the person realized, oh, this guy's got more degrees than I do, talking about me. But the whole thing was, if you don't value these children, if you don't see the innate goodness in them, then how can you really teach them? Because to me, teaching is an act of love. It's an act of seeing your humanity, valuing your humanity. And the things that this teacher was saying about his predominantly black classroom and these young people, and even said, you know, at one point, or intimated, I'm just here because I really don't want to be here, but this is my first job out of college. I want to get to a so-called better school district. So I would say that the first thing we do is have to find people, teachers, administrators who really love those kids.
Okay.
You know, I mean, the reason I know about remember the Good News Club decades ago was because those people loved on me. Those people said to me, you're valuable. And so that's the first thing, is to fix education. And we think about it during segregation, we hear these stories. And that's why so many people value HBCUs, because at least the one thing is that when I was teaching at Fisk as an adjunct for 10 years, I would go in that classroom and those kids are my kids. You know, they're not my kids biologically, but I see their humanity in a way that somebody else may not.
Yeah.
And so that's number one.
Yeah.
Number two, more funds.
Okay.
Number three, more autonomy. If the people who love those kids and care about those kids and see their value have the resources that some of these other places have, and have the autonomy to call the shots, oh yeah, you'll see stuff happen. You'll see magic happening, because children, and you know, as a parent, children will soak up stuff. You know, you give them something to do. Even when we were at Progressive Baptist, and the tutors, you know, some of the tutors started as freshmen, and senior year, those kids were still tutoring. Those little white kids were still tutoring the kids, and there would be connections made, and they would have these kids doing all kinds of things, because the more the kids knew that these people valued us, and they kept on coming back, because this was interesting. Okay, at one point, I went with a group of young white kids from Vanderbilt to a community center on the east side of Nashville. And the first thing the lady said was, if y'all coming, y'all need to stay. Y'all coming, don't come here for a semester. You gotta come here for at least a year, or we don't want you. Because these kids have had too many people in their lives leave them and not come back. And so that was the first thing we said to them. If you want to do this, you're signing up for at least a year, hopefully longer. And there were some people who did it freshman year, sophomore year, junior year, senior. So by the time they graduated, they had a relationship with these kids that I didn't have, because they had invested in them. And so to me, that's it. You got to invest in them, but you have to have the money, the resources, and the right people.
Okay. All right. Very good. That's a perspective I hadn't heard in a while. And considering that, church.
Yes, sir.
How's the church doing right now? If you could grade the body right now, and of course, I'm not asking for a railing indictment of everybody, because some people are doing a little more, some people are doing a little less. But in your view, is the church meeting the needs of the people right now?
Well, Reverend, I'll tell you this. I was at this retreat with Vanderbilt students from all over, right? And we were there for like 2.5 days out, you know, by the lake. And we were talking about social justice, and liberation, and income inequality, and educational disparity. And the interesting thing is that at one point we started talking about poverty, right? And at one point somebody said, well, part of the problem is poverty. Well, yeah, right, you know? And I'll say this because there was a pastor of a church here in Nashville was doing, you know, incredible work in communities. And at one point he was up in the pulpit and he said this. I don't know if it's true about all churches, but he said it in a general sense, at least applying to some churches. He said, congregation, the black church don't care nothing about poor people.
Wow.
I said, whoa, okay. I knew what he meant. That so much of the time we look at credentials and money and TV presence and celebrity. And the fact of the matter is that the way we need to value churches and ministries is not about how famous they are, how many times we can see them on YouTube, but how much, again, that whole notion of how much do you love these people? How much do you value these people? And sometimes when I look at our churches, I go, well, you value some people, but you don't value others. And so that's got to be our measuring stick. Remember what Jesus said? They know you are Christians by your love. They know you are Christians by your love.
Yeah.
And how do you manifest that love? To everybody. As Jesus said, the least of these. Yeah, the least.
Is there a difference between being a black man or a man of color? If there is a difference, there's a way to. If there's two sides to this, what would that difference? What would that difference be?
Now, people of color catch hell all throughout the world.
Okay.
We know that.
Okay.
But here in America, given our history, as a black man, there's a particular special history that we have that has to do with Middle Passage, has to do with slavery, has to do with the way in which people tried to strip us of our culture, has to do in the way in which we were defined as 3/5 of a person, right?
Right.
And has to do in the ways in which, even after emancipation, we were still fighting this whole notion that you're not a full citizen, whether it was manifested in Jim Crow, segregation, etc. So we're still dealing with that. We're still dealing with that. Yeah, I work at Vanderbilt and I got degrees and all of that, but that doesn't mean that when I go to Green Hills Mall and I'm walking with my wife or my daughter or whatever, that people don't look at me and go, why are you in this store? Looking at my skin color, maybe you can't afford to be in this store. Let's watch him more closely. Let's watch him more closely. So that's still there. That's still there, and we know that's still there. And so how do we as a black man, and it's even worse for black men because the whole notion is that a black man is to be feared. When I first came to Nashville in 2004, I lived on campus at Vanderbilt before I got this job living on campus, right? And I used to jog, and I would jog around Vanderbilt's perimeter. And Vanderbilt's changed, you know. I will say that Vanderbilt has changed in the 15 years I've been there. It's gotten better, got more diverse, brought more people of color and power and that kind of thing. But I was jogging around the perimeter, and as I was jogging, I would see people that didn't look like us, white folks, who as I was jogging, they were looking at me like, oh, he's coming after us. And I'm thinking, no, you don't have to look at me scared. I'm just jogging. And I realized I can't jog because they think I'm chasing them. And no, if anything, I should be running from you.
Right. Yes.
And so the racism that some people unconsciously perhaps or consciously hold within them is such that as a black man, I have to always be aware of that. I need to always be aware of that. I told my sons that. I told my daughter that, you know, as a black woman. You have to be aware of that, but that doesn't mean you have to be aware of that and always go around angry.
Okay.
But I think you have to be aware of that to be able to deal with it. You know, as Du Bois talks about, one ever feels his or her two-ness in the souls of black folks. Well, that two-ness means that yes, I am an American, and yes, I'm a citizen of this country, but yes, I also understand the ways in which people look at me differently, and may look at me differently because of the color of my skin and my ethnicity.
Okay. Man. I have to ask this before.
Sure.
Freedom. Is it a real possibility, or is it a hamster wheel type of a scenario for black people?
It's closer to the hamster wheel.
Okay.
And it's closer to the hamster wheel because even though I may be free, if my brothers and sisters are not free, am I truly free?
Gotcha.
I may be free. I may be able to go into a building at Vanderbilt and, oh, there's Dr. Dobson, he's a dean and he's done this and done that. But around the corner, down the street, Edge Hill Projects, what if one of them walks into that same room? How do they see that person, right? When I came to Vandy years ago, somebody said to me, you know, you're from the North, you need to understand that a lot of people who work on the grounds who cook the food and all of that, and they're wonderful, loving people. Some of my best friends are the cooks and the dishwashers and the people who clean the buildings and all of that, the janitorial staff. And even when I was in college, I worked as a janitor, so I have a great deal of empathy there. But the fact of the matter is I had to adjust because I hadn't seen that before. I was like, oh, wow. This is different. Now, that's a good job for some of those people, so I'm not hating on them, right? I don't know, you know, their educational background or whatever, but that's a good job for some. Many of them have had it for many years and put their kids through college, so God bless. But there's a sense in which I need to understand that my freedom is inextricably tied to the freedom of our community. It's not just one person is free. Bye, hey, y'all worry about, you know? No, can't do that. And so freedom is still something we're aspiring toward, but we're not there yet.
Okay, so racism is a very it's a very hot.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So we talk about racism between black folk and other races and all that kind of stuff. But how do we deal with the racism inside the house?
You know,
That's a real thing too.
that is a real thing. It was so interesting because we started talking about that at this retreat with mainly black students, Latino students, and one young black woman, a beautiful young sister, 18, 19-year-old, started talking about the fact she was a dark-skinned sister and she had experienced colorism in our community. And people in our community had said she's not as pretty as someone who's lighter. Well, that still happens. I mean, I was like, whoa. And she said it to a group of like 60 people because the hurt was there and the pain was there. So we do have that. We have classism in our community, you know? Based upon your credentials, my credentials, we may be able to go anywhere, but somebody else may not. So I think we as our community have to continue to fight to understand that we have a call toward the least of these. And everybody's talking about Kobe Bryant, and I'm gonna give Brother Bryant a shout, even though he's no longer with us, because I was reading an article just yesterday, you know, that said that one of the things he was trying to do was to address the homelessness in downtown LA, which everybody talks about as a big problem. But the fact that he understood as this multi-millionaire, world famous as we now can see, just how many people loved him and revered him, but he was saying, I gotta deal with this. So I think until we as our community continue to understand that our freedom is inextricably tied to the freedom of our brothers and our sisters and the rest of our community. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the man, we've talked about the educator and all that. Now, who is the writer? Who is Frank Dobson, the writer?
Well, you know, you're a reverend,
Yes,
and
sir.
you're a musician. And you know, I believe in the power of stories and storytelling.
No doubt. Yeah.
You know, I mean, I was nurtured by the black church, right?
Okay.
I went to church, went to Sunday school, I heard these stories, I sat through testimony. And, you know, the writer James Baldwin, from whom I actually was able to take a class when I was in graduate school, talks about the power of the witness. So as a black man, working class, inner city, Buffalo, New York, who's been blessed to be educated inside and outside of the halls of academia, I say, what are those stories that I need to tell? And I always think about it this way. The whole notion of the witness is, I'm gonna tell this because it's gonna help them. I'm gonna tell this because I'm gonna be a spokesperson on behalf of these people. I'm gonna tell this and my witness may help free them and open up the eyes of these other people. And so I believe that that's still very, very important to be able to witness and say, you need to know this, you need to see this, right?
Yeah.
And so to me, that's what the writing is about. Opening eyes, opening minds, and witnessing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what types of things do you write?
Well, I've written a couple of novels.
Okay.
This was the first one, The Race Is Not Given. I did this in back '99.
Okay.
And it was about a young black male who was sort of a world-class sprinter. I ran track in high school.
Okay.
Who was aspiring toward the Olympics, and something happened, he didn't make it. And then at some point, after a failed marriage and some other things, he's back home with his parents. He finds out he has a possibly terminal case of cancer.
Okay.
But he decides he wants to commit a rational suicide. And the whole question of self-worth, and then finds out maybe he's not gonna die, but he's already had this plan. And I think that in the book, I was really looking at some of the problems that we have today with young people taking their lives.
Okay.
And how do you, it's like 20 years old or something, how do you begin to have a sense of self-worth even when things don't work out for you like you had hoped, right? You aspire to being, in his case, an Olympian and an icon, didn't get it. You are not in the job you want. You're not in the situation you want. The relationship didn't happen the way you wanted it to do. And in the book, the ex is doing, you know, wonderful things in Hollywood and he's not. And so what do you do then? How do you pick up those pieces? Maybe they're broken pieces. Put them together and say, I'm enough to continue on and not, I'm gonna wallow in this, I'm gonna succumb to this, I'm gonna have a pity party, take my life, heaven forbid, or anything else. And so I'm really dealing with that question of self-worth and all of that. The second book is actually historical fiction. It's a series of short stories. Was published in 2010. And in 2010, some interesting things, or actually before 2010, some interesting things were happening in the state of Ohio. One of them, and I was telling somebody about this at the retreat, was that there was a shooting of an unarmed black kid in Cincinnati. His name was Timothy Thomas. So like before Trayvon Martin, this was a Trayvon Martin kind of thing. He was shot by a cop on the basis of driving tickets, parking tickets, just speeding and that kind of thing. Because the chase ensued, the cop kind of recognized his thing and shot the kid in the back. Timothy Thomas was like 19 years old. The city of Cincinnati explodes. But at that same time, when I was writing this book, it was the LeBron James high school phenomenon. And he was at Akron, St. Vincent, St. Mary's, and touring all over the country with his team. And I said, what would I do if I took a kid who was going to be, you know, a fictitious kid, but going to be the next great big thing in the NBA draft. And he has an encounter with the cop. And everybody knows he's going to make, you know, millions and zillions of dollars for Nike. Because even before LeBron signed his NBA contract, he signed a contract for $90 million with Nike. So I get this fictitious kid, and I have him have an encounter with the cop that's tragic. He dies. And the story opens with us being not with his family who are mourning him, and I talk about the family and the mom, but in the offices of the sports agents, the attorneys, who were going to represent him in the next week's draft. And the first thing they say is, what can we get for his life? Because he's gone now. We had an insurance policy on him. What can we get for his life? And I was looking at the whole question of the value of your life and my life. We know so much about Kobe, and we mourn him because of his famous exploits on the basketball court and afterward, right? Great philanthropist. The kid that I mentioned who kind of sparked the story, Timothy Thomas, most people don't know that story unless you're from that area. But I thought I would get a story and I'll talk about a kid who was going to be the next great LeBron, Kobe, Michael. Cops kill him. Of course it's going to be front page news, so he was going to be worth zillions and millions. But the whole question is, what about the value of our lives? And the interesting thing is, in that story, as I'm talking about it, it's kind of married to another story, because back in the 80s, there was a serial killer in my hometown of Buffalo, New York. His name was Joseph Christopher. He tried to incite a race war by killing black men. True story. This was around the same time as Atlanta child murders. In upstate New York City, Niagara Falls, Rochester, Buffalo, he killed about 13 black men. True story, look it up, 22 caliber killer. Not many people know about these victims. And I take this story, which is true, and I give you the footnote so you can follow the killing spree. His first victim was a kid by the name of Glenn Dunn, who was 14 years old, sitting in a car. He pops him in the head. Subsequent victims were mutilated. It was horrible. And the whole notion of this guy was, I'm going to incite a race war by killing black men, because they're going to then retaliate and we're going to have a race war, and that's what he wanted, right? Yeah. Kind of like the shooter in South Carolina years ago, similar kind of thing. Only this was in the 80s. Not that many people know about that story, right? I do, because I'm from that town. But I needed to witness to that story because it seemed as though nobody cared about those people enough that this wasn't a famous story. So I write about it. The title of that piece is Rendered Invisible, because the victims were rendered invisible. Because somebody said, you're not rich, you're not famous, you're not Kobe, you're not LeBron, you're not Reverend Baxter, you're not Frank Dobson. We're just going to not care about the story. And so for me, writing is really the act of witnessing, of saying, we ought to know about this, right? We ought to hear about this. We ought to begin to educate one another. And so that's what I try to do in much of my work. And all of it's not about gruesome stuff. Some of it's more uplifting, right? Right? May I read a poem?
Yes,
just to give you an example of that.
Please.
I used to be, years ago, I was a welfare worker.
Okay.
When I was working on my master's degree, right? So I worked for the welfare department outside of Las Vegas, right? And I had a senior citizen client by the name of Elnora Cephas. And I wrote a poem for Elnora C. because she really inspired me. And so this is the poem I wrote years ago, and this is kind of, again, witnessing.
Okay.
I only met this woman like once, maybe twice. I went to her for a home visit. And she said something to me. She was proud of me, but I was proud of her. So I'll just read you the poem.
Okay.
For Elnora C., snuff dipper from Texas, large product of the place whose largeness is legend, she smiles. I'm so proud to see our young peoples with good jobs. Y'all got the chance. I'm so glad the welfare sent you out to visit me. There's a black detective come to the projects too. Sometime he stopped by. I calls him Shaft. As I look around the room, she smiles brown and warm. I do too. To cradle the babe, to court the girl, to confess to this old woman that Shaft and I are wanting, like her worn birth certificate which shows no date. Snuff stains, her true testament, recall the Texas soil of her labor and carpet the room like fruit from a tree before which I wish to burn my books, burn my forms, and bow.
Good stuff.
Well, and for me, thank you, and for me it was about, I'm visiting her. She's so proud of me, and literally she was a snuff dipper, and so when you went in there, you had to walk carefully or you'd walk into a puddle of snuff.
Mm-hmm.
But she was like, these young people, and y'all are doing great, and you visiting me for the welfare department. And I heard her story about how she migrated from Texas to Vegas, and how their kids didn't come visit her. But I was seeing the strength in this old black woman. I was seeing the resilience. I was seeing the pride. And it made me say, I want to tell people about this, because what she represented is how we got over.
Mm-hmm.
How you or me may have grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents who are represented by her, and how we have to continue to honor that legacy. And that's what it is about. Let's honor that legacy. No matter how high we get, honor the legacy.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Sir.
So that's the kind of stuff I try to do, my brother.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Okay, so a couple more things and I'll let you go. First, I want to
Yes.
do a little word association. I'll speak a word and you say the first thing that pops in your brain.
Okay.
Freedom.
God,
Father.
heaven,
Mother.
heaven,
Children.
blessings,
Money.
tool,
Ability.
God-given,
Church.
pillar,
Teachers.
mentors,
Foundation.
God.
Absolutely. Okay. Next thing. If you had the opportunity to give advice to two different people, what would you tell them? First person, they are at the beginning of their journey. They want to figure out, because a lot of times people ask, what do you want to do when you get this age or whatever? And there's always that period of just trying to figure it out, right? And the other person is the person who is in the middle of their journey and they might be having some struggles. So what would you say to the first and to the second?
You know, I'm going to use Kobe Bryant again, and I'll use myself.
Okay.
When I write, and my daughter, got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and she sometimes is trying to write, and I'm like, Jasmine, you don't understand. When I write a poem, I might go through 30 drafts. I might go through 40 drafts.
Mm-hmm.
It's a slow process. I'm preparing, I'm studying, I'm going back and forth, and it may take a while, but I want to get it right. And I was listening to basketball players talk about Kobe, and they always talked about, yeah, he was a great athlete, but everybody in the NBA is a great athlete, right? Or most of them. But they said his preparation, and how there was one player, Jason Williams, who played for the Bulls and at Duke, and he was crying, and he said, when I was in the pros at the Chicago Bulls, I went in beforehand and I put up 400 shots, and when I got there, because they were playing the Lakers, Kobe was already there. And I shot and I shot and I shot and I shot, and I stopped. I sat on the sideline, Kobe was still going. And afterwards, after he finished, he said, I want you to know that there's no way you're going to out-prepare me and outwork me. And everybody talked about, yeah, he was blessed athletically, but I'm going to outwork you and out-prepare you. So I would say to any young people, whether you want to be a musician, a writer, a scholar, a minister, a preacher, or whatever, a teacher, preparation. Work at your craft, work at it, and if it's really your craft and your calling. There's a book by a minister by the name of Kirby John Caldwell, The Gospel of Good Success, and he talks about the whole notion of the calling. And then when you find that calling, and this is somebody who was on Wall Street making a whole bunch of money, and the call of God came, and he left that six-figure income to go and preach. And now he has a church in Houston, Texas. But my pastor back in Ohio gave us that book, and we read it for a men's group. And the whole notion of the calling is it's something you love, but you still got to work at it. You still got to prepare. And so to me, preparation is key.
Okay.
And then the person in mid-career,
Mid-career, kind of having some struggles. You know, there's always those moments of, am I really doing the right thing? Because things are tough right now. So, you know, how do we deal with that person?
I think, again, that whole notion of the gospel of good success, if this is your calling, you stay in it. Maybe it's not. And then you find what that calling is. You seek it, right?
Okay.
You seek it. And the Bible says, seek and you shall find. So seek it. And maybe you're called to do something else. You know? But if it is, you stay in it. Maybe you have to go to a different job or find a different venue or become an entrepreneur to do that. But you continue to do that. And the other thing is that you make sure that you surround yourself with people, who are supportive of that endeavor. I tell the students at Vanderbilt who are struggling, and we have a program called the Posse Program, and the whole notion of the Posse Program is, there was a student years ago, not at Vanderbilt, at another school, who didn't make it, who was like from an inner city background, and went to a prestigious school and didn't make it, but came back and said to a mentor or somebody, if I had my posse with me, I would have made it. If I had my people with me, I would have made it. So I would say, if you're in mid-career, make sure you got your people around you, your supporters around you, spouse, children, whatever. Because you need your people. And what I told the two students at the retreat, because some of them were struggling, we're not sure we want to be here, we want to stay here. I said, really, in terms of your people, you only need one. Hopefully you have more than one. You only need one who will be with you, who says, I got you. We're in this together. And that's what you need when you're struggling. All of a sudden, who can I rely on? Who can I know is invested in me? And I guess my theme with you today, my brother, is the whole notion of investing in other people and making sure that when you're mid-career, you find people, you seek them out who will invest in you. Because we all need somebody to invest in us. I mean, that's what the Lord did. He invested with the Son, the Lord died for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, lastly, how do we find you? How do we order your books? How do we get in touch with you? How does that process work?
Okay. Well, I'm at Vanderbilt.
Okay.
And you can easily find me at Vandy, frank.dobson at vanderbilt.edu. You can Google me. I'm on LinkedIn, Frank Dobson Jr. I used to have a website that's down right now. I have a page on Author's Den. If you look at Author's Den, I've got a page there. I love talking to churches and all of that. And I would say this, my ending shot would be that there are people out there who have stories to tell. Maybe books to write, poems to write, raps to write, songs to write. Tell those stories. And I would be glad to dialogue with you about that. I used to teach creative writing at Fisk. And some of those kids went on to have things, because I was pouring into them and saying, this is good stuff and it ought to be. And the proudest thing for me was, like a proud papa, one of the young men played basketball at Fisk. And Miles was not the best student in the class, but he wasn't the worst, but there was so much talent. And I pushed him, I'm a black man, I'm going to push you. But the interesting thing is, just this year, he went on, got his bachelor's degree from Fisk, got his master's degree. Just this year, he wrote me up, cooked me up on LinkedIn and said, Dr. D, I just published my first book. You know how proud I was? And I said to him, I knew that. I knew that. So for him, I was one of those people who said, you can do this. And so to me, that's it. Mid-career, you just need those people. You got to find your people.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time, sir. I enjoyed this.
I enjoyed it too, brother.
Yes, sir. Look forward to doing it again.
May God bless you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.